Okay, so this schematic here is really just kind of a review of what we just learned about financial intermediaries and the banking system in general. So we've got banks in the middle here, and the goal of banks, in this sense, their function as a financial intermediary, is to bring borrowers and savers or lenders together. And so savers are taking their deposits and they're putting them in the bank. The bank is taking those deposits, or a fraction of those, and they're using those to provide funds for loans to borrowers. And so that's the main way it works. And then we see kind of on the bottom here how the cash flow works its way back through the banking system. So if I made a loan, I'm going to eventually get payments from the person that borrowed with interest. And so those, again, are going to be managed by the bank. So the borrower repays the bank, and the bank is going to pay back the savers with the interest that they're paying on either their savings account or some other type of mechanism that they've engaged in. So that was just kind of a review how the banking system works in general as viewed as a financial intermediary. Okay, so now we're going to dive into a little bit of accounting. Now, if you're an accounting major, you will find that our version of accounting is very basic, and that's fine. We're taking a higher level view here of the banking system just to get a basic understanding of how it operates and how it can potentially get into trouble. And if it does get into trouble, what are the potential ways to manage that or manage the risk associated to that on our economy. So this is a balance sheet, or we're going to work through a balance sheet for a bank. And on any balance sheet, we're going to have what we call assets. Again, those are the things we own. And we also have liabilities, which are things we owe. And so we'll see for banks, the main asset is loans, or are loans. And the main liabilities are the deposits. So if you have a deposit in a checking account for $2,000, that's a liability for the bank. They owe you $2,000. That's the amount of money in your account. And so that's going to be a liability for the bank. Now, stockholders' equity is simply the value of the bank. And the value of the bank is simply the value of its assets minus its liabilities. And that tells you how much equity the stockholders have, or what the value of the bank is. So if you own stock in a company, the value of that stock is basically tied to the equity, or how much the firm is worth, which is in some sense viewed as the value of its assets now and in the future, the value of the stream of those assets, minus the value of any liabilities that they may have. So in the end, the way we've set this up is that you have to have total assets equal to total liabilities plus the value of the firm or stockholders' equity. So that's going to be important when we work with the balance sheet to remember that both sides here are going to have to add up. So here's an example balance sheet. So this was taken from Citibank, their balance sheet, I think in 2016. And so everything here is in terms of, must be millions of dollars that we're looking at. And so we see the different types of assets that a bank has. So reserves are what they keep on hand, the cash they're keeping on hand, or on reserve at the Federal Reserve Bank, and deposit at the Federal Reserve Bank. Cash equivalents are other similar types of instruments. Typically, cash equivalents are cash deposits that the bank keeps at other banks, other private banks. And long-term investments, those are the loans and other things that the bank has made. So these are basically just loans. Okay, and so we see all the value of the assets that the bank has. They have their reserves, they have cash equivalents, which are very similar to reserves, and they have their long-term investments, which are typically going to be loans. So we add it up here, and it's $1,801 million worth of total assets that Citibank has on the left-hand side here of their balance sheet. So now on the other side, we have their liabilities. So you can see the biggest liability that they have is what I call demand deposits, which are the deposits of account holders at the bank. So you have a checking account with Citibank, your deposit counts as a liability for Citibank. And so we see that they're only keeping on hand in reserves a fraction of the total deposits that they have. They have $935 million in deposits, only $74 million in reserves. Now, there's other things that the bank is going to do. So they also engage in some short-term borrowing. Turns out this is typically with other banks. So short-term borrowing is usually with other banks. And so a lot of times what they'll do, so you use your checking account more or less on a particular day, and that may cause the bank's reserves to go below the required amounts. Remember, banks are required to have a certain fraction of deposits on hand as reserves. If they go below that, what am I going to do? Or they need more money to meet the requirements of people asking for money, is they can borrow short term from another bank that has extra reserves. And so that happens all the time. And there's a specific market for that. It's called the federal funds market. And banks are working in that market all of the time. And then banks have some other long-term debt, which can be various types of borrowing that they may engage in. So maybe I decide to build a new branch, and so I have to take out potentially a loan from another bank to make that work, or I issue a bond, something along those lines would count as long-term debt. And so we see their total liabilities here, $1,572 million. Stockholders' equity then is just the difference between total assets and total liabilities. So that 229 is simply the 1801 minus the 1572 is my stockholders' equity. And when I take those all together, I get that both sides of my balance sheet always add up to exactly the same amount. Okay, so one thing I just want to mention that I realized I forgot to slip in there is that long-term investments can also include the physical capital that the bank has. So they have their buildings, their branches, and all of that stuff. And that's worth a certain amount of money, the value of the assets. Like if you own a house, that's worth something. And so that would show up in the value of long-term investments as an asset. So what I'd like you to do, so this is a lot to take in, a lot of little details. You'll only get them down if you give it some practice. And so I've got a question up on Learning Objective 5 in Canvas, and I want you to give that a shot, and that will get you a little bit more familiar with the bank balance sheet and associated terminology.